be studying the skeleton of the upper part. Now let's focus on three bones that we've discussed so far, being the clavicle, the scapula, and the humerus. Now if you see here, this is the sternum. Attached with the sternum is the clavicle bone on the medial end. At the lateral end, the clavicle bone is attached to the scapula. The scapula is connected by the glenoid cavity to the humerus. First of all, let's discuss the three joints between the bones. First we'll talk about is the sternoclavicular joint. So the first joint we'll talk about is the sternoclavicular joint, which is between the sternum and the clavicle. This joint is a synovial joint, and it's a saddle joint as it's a concave or convex surface. Now between the clavicle and the sternum, this joint has a capsule called as a fibrous capsule. The sternoclavicular joint is stabilized by three ligaments, being anterior and the posterior sternoclavicular ligaments, an interclavicular ligament, and a costoclavicular ligament. Now if you focus on the names, the anterior and the posterior sternoclavicular ligaments are between the sternum and the clavicle. The fibrous capsule we've discussed about thickens anteriorly to form the anterior sternoclavicular ligament and posteriorly to form the posterior sternoclavicular ligament. Another ligament connecting the proximal ends of the two clavicles and the manubrium is the interclavicular ligament, from the two bones connecting each other and to the manubrium sternum. The third ligament is the costoclavicular ligament, which attaches from the clavicle to the first rib. Now, as I've said, this is a synovial joint and it's a saddle joint. We also see that the joint is a compound joint, as on this joint it is a combination of three bones. Three bones are joining together. First is the clavicle, second is the manubrium, and the third bone is the first rib, which makes this joint a compound variety. The next joint we're going to talk about is the acromioclavicular joint. As the name indicates, this is between the scapula and the clavicle. I repeat, this is between the scapula and the clavicle. Now, as we've discussed already, the clavicle at the lateral end joins with the acromion process of the scapula. This makes it to be the acromioclavicular joint. This joint is a plain synovial joint and is reinforced by a capsule, which is a fibrous capsule. Providing additional support to this joint are two ligaments, one being the acromioclavicular ligament. The acromioclavicular ligament arises from the acromion end, the acromion process, going all the way towards the lateral end of the clavicle, covering the joint and giving it support. The other ligament we're going to talk about is the coracoclavicular ligament. The coracoclavicular ligament is between the inferior surface of the clavicle and the acromion process. I repeat the name coracoclavicular ligament. Now, as we discussed already, at the inferior surface of the clavicle, at the lateral end was a tubercle called the conoid tubercle and a trapezoid ridge. The coracoclavicular ligament arises from this area, that is being the conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge, and attaches all the way towards the acromion process. This ligament has two parts, being the trapezoid ligament and the conoid ligament. So the coracoclavicular ligament has two parts, trapezoid ligament and conoid ligament. Arising from the trapezoid ridge is the trapezoid ligament, which goes all the way down towards the upper surface of the acromion process. Whereas the part of the coracoclavicular ligament arising from the conoid process will originate from the conoid tubercle and going all the way towards the root of the acromion process. These provide support to the joint, these ligaments provide support to the joint The next joint we'll talk about is the shoulder joint, also called as the glenohumeral joint. Now if you see the name, there's an attachment between the humerus bone and the glenoid cavity of the scapula. Moving on further about the joint, we can see that the glenoid cavity is rather small as compared to the larger head of the humerus. This joint is therefore supported by, first of all, we'll talk about the glenoid labrum. This is a fibrocartilaginous ring surrounding the glenoid cavity and providing support to the head of the humerus. It basically expands the area for the humerus to settle into the glenoid cavity. Besides that, we have three ligaments. First, this capsule, the glenoid labrum, is thickened on three parts, being the middle, superior and inferior glenohumeral ligaments. The next we move is with another ligament which provides support to the joint, that is the coracohumeral ligament, arising from the coracoid process going all the way towards the neck of the humerus. The third ligament providing support is the transverse humeral ligament, which spans between the two tubercles of the humerus. Now if we focus on the shoulder joint, we've talked about three ligaments providing support, first being superior, middle and inferior glenohumeral ligaments. The second we've talked about is the coracohumeral ligament arising from the root of the coracoid process going all the way towards the neck of the humerus. Third, we talk about the transverse humeral ligament, which is spanning the distance between the two tubercles. These are the ligaments providing support to the shoulder joint. Now if you can see, these ligaments are deficient inferiorly, because of which the dislocation at this joint commonly occurs at the inferior part. Providing additional support to the shoulder joint are the rotator cuff muscles, being supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis and the teres minor muscle. All these muscles, they merge together and join the capsule between the humerus and the scapula. Another thing we can see in this area is the acromioclavicular joint. Now, as we've said already, the acromioclavicular joint is being provided stability by two ligaments. First, the acromioclavicular ligament spanning between the clavicle and the acromion. The second we've discussed was the coracoclavicular ligament. It had two parts, the trapezoid part and the conoid part. Arising from the trapezoid ridge and coming towards the upper part of the coracoid process is the trapezoid part of the coracoclavicular ligament. Arising from the conoid tubercle is the conoid part arising and spanning the distance between the clavicle and the acromion process of the scapula. When we focus on the shoulder joint, as this is a ball and socket variety, that is a synovial joint of ball and socket variety, it means it's providing movement in different planes, being flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, medial rotation, lateral rotation and circumduction. Axilla is a pyramidal shaped structure which is connecting the upper limb and the chest wall. And if you see about the axilla, it's a pyramidal shaped structure. We talk about the apex, a base and four walls, anterior, posterior, medial and lateral. Now if you talk about the apex of the axilla, it is formed anteriorly by the clavicle, posteriorly by the scapula and medially by the clavicle. Moving all the way down the base is formed by fascias in the skin. That is skin, superficial fascia and the axillary fascia. When you talk about the four sides, we have anterior wall, posterior wall, medial wall and the lateral wall. Talking about the bony structures, the medial wall is formed by the upper four ribs, Posteriorly, this is formed by three muscles: subscapularis, teres major, and latissimus dorsi. Anterior wall is formed by two muscles: pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, and the clavipectoral fascia. Medially, as I said, the upper foreribs. Attached to these foreribs is a muscle called as serratus anterior. The lateral wall is a very narrow wall because the anterior and the posterior walls converge on it, and is formed by the upper part of the shaft of the humerus and the muscles, two muscles attached to the tip, that's the coracobrachialis, and the short head of the bicep brachii. This is the model of the upper limb, and we'll discuss the muscles we see attached here. The biggest muscle over here, covering the entire shoulder area, is the deltoid muscle. Once we remove the deltoid muscle, we can see that this is the clavicle, this is the spine of the scapula, this is the acromion process, this is the humerus bone. These joints and bones are covered by muscles. Now, superior to the spine of the scapula is the supraspinatus muscle. Then we have the infraspinatus muscle. Then is teres minor muscle and the teres major muscle. I repeat, this is the spine of the scapula, this is the clavicle, this is the humerus bone. Above the spine of the scapula is the supraspinatus muscle, then the infraspinatus muscle, then we have the teres minor, and then we have the teres major muscle. Once we twist this around, we come to the back side. Here is the muscle attachment for the subscapularis muscle. When we move this model laterally, we see the humerus bone. Attached to it is the long head and the short head of the bicep brachii muscle, and a muscle called as the coracobrachialis. Attached in the lateral end is the brachialis muscle.